Some losses don't announce themselves at extraction. The frames look right, the colour is good, the cappings are solid and white. You run the extractor in late summer, jar it up, stack the cases in the cellar, and don't think about it again until February. Then you open a jar, and it started to ferment. It happened to beekeepers before 1932 too, and in the commercial apiaries of Ohio and Indiana, where dozens of colonies represented a family's livelihood through winter, a fermented harvest wasn't a disappointment. It was a ruin. A season's work turned to syrup by the time anyone noticed. The beekeepers who solved that problem didn't solve it with an instrument. Refractometers weren't part of the working beekeeper's kit in 1932. The precision optical tool that reads honey moisture with a number on a scale didn't arrive in widespread commercial use until decades later. What these beekeepers developed instead was a reading system built from 4 observable signals that the colony itself was generating every season in sequence reliably before anyone thought to ask for a number. And the most important of those 4 signals had nothing to do with whether the honey was capped. If that kind of loss has happened to you, a fermented jar discovered months after extraction, it's worth dropping a note below. More common than most beekeepers ever admit out loud. To understand what the 1932 method was actually reading, it's first necessary to understand what the bees are doing inside those supers. Because most of what gets passed along about harvest timing treats capping as the answer. And capping is part of the answer. Only part of it. Nectar arrives in the hive at roughly 70 to 80% water. The bee that collected it has already added invertase, the enzyme that begins breaking down complex sugars into simpler ones during the flight home. But the real work of turning that nectar into honey is the work of evaporation. And evaporation is not a passive process. Worker bees fan the nectar in open cells with their wings, moving air across the liquid surface. They spread it in thin sheets across the upper rim of cells to increase surface area exposed to airflow. They regurgitate and re-expose it repeatedly. This is active, metabolically expensive biological work. The colony runs it continuously during a flow, sometimes for days on a single batch of nectar, before the moisture drops far enough for the cell to be sealed. That sealing threshold is approximately 18% moisture content. Below it, yeast organisms present in honey cannot reproduce at rates that cause spoilage. The honey is shelf-stable. Above that level, given enough time and the right storage temperature, fermentation becomes probable. Bees seal cells when their evaporative assessment of the moisture content approaches that threshold. That sounds reliable. Under most conditions it is. But here is where capping alone starts to mislead. Bees assess moisture through evaporative mechanics, not through any precise biological instrument of their own. During periods of high ambient humidity, common in the river bottom country of Ohio and Indiana, through the middle weeks of summer, bees can cap honey that is marginally above the fermentation threshold. Not dramatically above it, not visibly wrong, but enough that jars stored through winter, particularly in cool, damp conditions, begin showing the slow bubble of yeast activity by February. This is not a failure of the bees. It is a limitation of the capping indicator under specific atmospheric conditions. The 1932 commercial beekeepers understood this not because they had measured it biochemically. They understood it because they had watched it fail. Seasons where the capping looked right and the honey didn't keep. Patterns that became visible when you were tracking outcomes across 10 or 15 years of apiary records. The observation came first, the understanding followed, and it led them to a different question. Not, is this honey capped? But, is this honey finished? The shake test is the most commonly cited pre-instrument method for reading honey readiness. And it is the most commonly misapplied. The version most beekeepers practice involves picking up a frame horizontally and giving it a firm shake. If uncapped honey flies out, the frame is deemed too wet. If nothing flies, the frames are considered ready. That test answers one question. Is there loose liquid nectar in open cells that hasn't begun to ripen at all? That's useful information at one end of the spectrum, but it isn't the question the 1932 beekeepers were asking. The correct application uses a different motion and a different observation. You hold the frame horizontal over a clean surface and tilt it slowly rather than shaking. You are not asking whether nectar flies out. You are asking whether honey in open cells moves at all, and if it does, how it moves. Water-thin nectar, 60 or 70% moisture, moves immediately and pools at the rim of the tilted cell. Partially ripened honey thickens, it stays, or it moves slowly, and it strings rather than drips. Honey at or near the extraction threshold is nearly motionless when tilted, and will stretch into a continuous thread from a cell, rather than fall in a droplet when a finger passes lightly across the comb surface. The difference between what drips and what strings. That's what the test was built to read. Most beekeepers apply this test to capped frames, the ones they've already decided are candidates for extraction. The 1932 commercial beekeepers were applying it to the frames that weren't yet fully capped, specifically those frames because that was where the diagnostic information lived. A frame that is 60% capped and whose remaining open cells show honey that strings rather than drips is a frame that is 48 to 72 hours from full readiness under dry conditions. A frame that is 70% capped but whose open cells still show loose water-thin liquid may not be ready even when it finishes capping, particularly if humid weather continues. You weren't reading completion, you were reading direction. The second indicator the 1932 method relied on is one that almost no contemporary harvest guidance addresses. Bees do not cap honey randomly across a frame. Capping progresses in a pattern, and that pattern is consistent enough across seasons and colonies that experienced beekeepers could read it as a timing indicator rather than a simple percentage. The pattern follows the physical geometry of the frame and the colony's moisture management priorities. Bees begin capping at the bottom of the frame and progress upward. Within that upward progression, they work outward from the center of the frame toward the edges. This reflects thermal and airflow conditions inside the super. The center and lower portions maintain slightly more stable temperature that facilitates evaporation, so those cells ripen first. The upper corners are the last zone to receive consistent airflow. They are last to ripen. A frame that shows capping across the lower 2/3 and the central portion, with the upper corners still open, is a frame in the final stage of the ripening cycle. Those open corners represent the last portion of nectar to complete evaporation, typically 24 to 48 hours behind the center. A frame where capping has started in scattered, irregular patches rather than progressively from the bottom is a frame where the colony may be struggling with high moisture nectar or where forage quality dropped mid-cycle. Those frames warrant extra attention before they go near the extractor. The 1932 beekeepers weren't reading how much of the frame was capped, they were reading where the capping line sat and whether it was moving in the right direction from one visit to the next. If this kind of systematic observation changes how you read your supers before harvest, a subscription keeps this type of content coming. There is more to work through. The third indicator is the physical weight of the super relative to its apparent fullness. During an active nectar flow, bees are continuously adding fresh nectar, and a super gains measurable weight each visit. When the flow ends and the colony shifts into consolidation, new nectar stops coming in, but evaporation continues working through the open cells. The super's weight stabilizes and then begins a slight decline as water leaves the uncapped cells, and as the capping of finished cells closes off the active evaporation zone. A super that looks 80% capped and lifts heavier than expected is still actively processing. A super that feels compact and slightly lighter than you'd estimate by looking is further along in the ripening sequence than the capping pattern alone would suggest. Some beekeepers in the 1932 Ohio commercial tradition also used sound as a secondary indicator. Tapping the side of the super box lightly with the butt of a hive tool and listening for the return. A super full of sealed honey returns a lower, denser sound than a super still carrying frames with liquid in motion. Neither of these tests is precise. Neither was intended to be used alone. They were 2 of 4 data points, not a conclusion. The fourth indicator, the one the 1932 beekeepers identified as the most reliable single signal in the system, and the one that has no equivalent in contemporary harvest timing guidance. When the primary nectar flow ends and the colony transitions into dearth conditions, something happens inside the super that is observable to a beekeeper who knows what to look for. During an active flow, bees are working throughout the super at all hours of daylight. Foragers return with nectar continuously, pass it to receivers, and that material moves upward through the hive body and into the super frames. The super is populated. Bees are present on nearly every frame across the box. When the flow stops and the colony shifts into consolidation mode, the bees begin moving honey inward and downward. They are not abandoning the super, they are compressing their winter stores toward the cluster, and as they do this, their distribution across the super changes in a specific and readable way. The outer frames of the super begin to empty first as bees move that honey toward the center positions. The upper corners of frames that were left open are capped as consolidation completes the evaporation work the flow hadn't yet finished. The cluster of bees you observe in the super before lifting the cover has shifted toward the center frames and thinned on the peripheral ones. At the entrance, mid-afternoon activity includes a slight increase in orientation-like hovering movements near the entrance opening, which are not new foragers departing, but workers evaluating the hive's external condition during a period of reduced forager traffic. This behavioral shift signals that the colony has entered the consolidation window, which means the extraction window has opened. Here is the complete picture the 1932 beekeepers were reading when they decided to pull supers. Capping progression at the lower 2/3 or more, moving correctly from center outward, with upper corners filling in rather than still wide open. Open cells showing the string test, not the drip test, on frames that weren't yet fully sealed. Super weight in the lighter than expected range for its apparent fullness. And bees concentrated toward the center of the super, with peripheral frames beginning to show the first signs of emptying as consolidation moved honey inward. When all 4 signals aligned, they were in the extraction window. That window was 3 to 5 days. Pull within it, and the moisture content of the extracted honey was reliable. The fermentation risk through storage was low, and yield was at its season maximum. Pull before the alignment of all 4 signals, and you are blending uncapped nectar with finished honey through your entire batch, raising the average moisture content of everything that went through the extractor. Pull after the window closed, and the bees had already started moving that surplus back down into the winter cluster. Light boxes after hard work, 3 to 5 days. 4 signals told you exactly where you were within it. The reason this method was replaced was not that it stopped working. A refractometer gives a precise number, and a number is teachable at scale in a way that 4 converging observations are not. Extension services could publish a threshold, extract when moisture reads below 18%. You could not publish a rule for how a super sounds when you tap it with a hive tool, or what it means when the bees have begun to vacate the peripheral frames. The knowledge became unteachable at that scale. So it wasn't taught. What replaced it was accurate for the single variable of moisture content in the cells you happen to sample at the moment you happen to check. It said nothing about where the colony was in its seasonal cycle, nothing about whether the colony was still in active ripening or had shifted into consolidation. Nothing about whether the open cells alongside the capped ones were at 17 or at 22% moisture. Nothing about how many days remained before the bees began reclaiming that surplus for the cluster. 1 number, 1 moment, 1 frame. For a beekeeper working today, this system remains applicable as a complement to refractometer readings, or as the primary method in operations where precision instruments aren't part of the routine. Begin reading supers approximately 2 weeks before the expected dearth onset in your region. The end of the primary flow is more important than any calendar date, and in most temperate North American locations it's predictable within a week or two based on local bloom sequence and the behavior of forager traffic through the middle weeks of summer. In Ohio and Indiana, the primary white clover and basswood flow typically concludes in late July or early August. That 2-week period before the dearth becomes visible in forager traffic is the period where all 4 signals become relevant. Visit each super with the tilt test rather than the shake test. Note where the capping line sits on the frame and whether it is progressing in the correct direction. Register the super's weight relative to your previous visit, and observe where the bees are clustered in the super before you lift the cover. The 1932 beekeepers visited their supers more frequently during this 2-week period than at any other point in the season. Not to intervene, to build a picture across consecutive observations. A single reading tells you the state, multiple readings tell you the direction. And direction in this system is everything. A refractometer reads a number accurately at the moment you use it. What it cannot tell you is whether the colony is moving toward readiness or past it, whether you are 3 days inside the window or 3 days past it, whether the opened cells alongside those capped cells are finishing or have barely started. The 1932 beekeepers had no number. They had 4 signals read across 2 weeks of consistent observation, and those 4 signals told them everything the number tells, and more. That kind of reading cannot be purchased. It develops through the habit of watching the same colonies in the same season, with the same question on every visit. Is this honey finished, or is it still becoming? If you found this useful, a like helps this content reach other beekeepers working through these questions. Subscribe for more historical method, more biological reasoning, more of the precision that was built before the catalogues arrived. And here is the question worth sitting with when you walk the yard this summer. In your apiary, in your region, do you know when your consolidation window opens? Not as a date on the calendar, as a set of observable conditions the colony is generating before you ever lift a frame. That question, asked 2 weeks before the dearth in your area, is still what determines whether you jar honey in August or discover syrup in February.